right, everyone, welcome to part one in this multi-part series of bow hunter topics, bow hunter tips and tactics, if you will. And I'm going to say this is not just specific to Western application bow hunting. This is kind of anywhere. First thing I want to talk about is multiple pin sights. You know, this is a topic that I've overlooked for a long time because I just learned it a long time ago and I just moved on from it. I try to, when we set somebody up with a multiple pin sight at our store, try to explain to them how to sight in and how to use them. It's a reference really as the different pins. But more so now that I have a 9-year-old and he's getting more competitive and he's able to shoot a little more distance, and now we're starting to talk more about the sight picture of what you're looking at when you're aiming at an animal. You know, right now it's 3D for him. He hasn't been able to shoot his bow at a big game or even turkey yet. He's not quite at the right poundage, but nonetheless, it brings up the topic of visually what you should be looking at with your sight picture. Now, again, you know, I've for a long time now been using a 5-pin sight with a slider, and I've dabbled with the 3-pin, with the 4-pin, even with the Spot Hog, you know, the double pin. I'm just comfortable with the 5-pin system. Whatever you choose is fine for you, based off your reasoning, right? If you like to have 2 pins, you just want simplicity, you just want 1 pin because of, again, same thing, simplicity, that's fine. I'm going to try to talk about a couple topics here that you need to consider when you're looking at aiming and what type of principles to adopt while you're aiming, so that way you can practice it all season, so when it happens in the woods or in the field, you're not having to think and get derailed. You know, a lot of things that I talk about, the main topics that I've written on my books is eliminating the disconnect. If you can be smooth and efficient every time, so that way when you're into the woods there is no disconnect, or the disconnect is minimized, you're going to be able to hopefully harvest more animals. So hopefully you can kind of see this body size here. I'm not a very good artist, but I also always like to try. Okay, so we're just going to say this is the front shoulder of an animal, broadside view, and again, starting with multiple pin sights. In the event someone has a multiple pin sight, and let's just say that the area we're going to be aiming at for this particular topic, let's just say it happens to be around this area, which is just easy to reference. Okay, whether it's 3D archery, that might be the bottom of the 10 ring. If it's animals, that's a spot that some of you may be looking to aim depending on the angle, position, body position, shot scenario. If you're looking to aim at that spot, okay, and you have your sight housing you're looking through, and let's just say that this animal, you've ranged it or you've judged it, whatever the case is, happens to be within those gaps of the pins. Obviously your references that you may set, whether you set a 20, 30, 40, 50 reference or a 15, 25, 35, whatever your reference break down to, again, that's up to you. For me, it's easy to remember the 10-yard increments. I've always sighted in 20 to 60 and had my 60 on a driver. So in this example, we're going to say this shooter has a multiple pin sight. Let's say this target happens to be 35 yards, okay? So he's got his top pin, green pin's going to be here, okay? 20. His next pin, let's just say whatever color it is, happens to be here, 30-yard pin. And then his 40-yard pin, try to use a different color again, happens to be down here, all right? So essentially what you could be looking at on a target is, and depending on how your gap of your pins is a picture like this. Now, some people do not like to gap shoot. What that term means is aim between the pins, where you really don't have anything constant to aim. You're just aiming in between the pins. So this is what I personally like to do. I've always been able to do it fine. It really depends on how tight your pin movement is. If you have a lot of pin movement, this may feel weird because you're aiming at a target with no spot or dot on it in between 2 pins, 2 references. So if this is the style of aiming you're going to do, then it's pretty simple. You identify the 30, 40 pin, you know this is 35. You're going to be holding somewhere in between that gap, okay? You know, following the back of the leg line, wherever you're choosing to aim, that would be the theory or the approach. Someone who does not like to gap shoot and they want to reference, you still need to be able to put your pins on the target, still need to identify that spot is in between those 30 and 40 yard pins, then you can move to a constant reference. If you know that, possibly there's a tuft of hair or something up here, and your 30 yard pin happens to be right in the same plane of that tuft of hair, then potentially you hold your 30 yard pin on that, possibly that tuft of hair, just right of it, okay? Or in this example, maybe the 40 yard pin happens to be right at the belly line, okay? Maybe your 40 yard reference pin happens to be right there. And you know that's a good constant line. You can hold your pin on that right behind the back of the leg, and you know that because of the gap, if your point of aim is going to be in between that 30, 40 yard pin, that's going to be your constant. You hold that pin on that constant. So gap shooting or identifying a sight picture and holding on a reference, on a constant. Those are the kind of the different methods that are talked about, coached, or utilized in the field. So in a multiple pin setting again, in the event this happens to be again, a little different scenario, let's just say that it's a 53 yard target, where you're going to be looking at a possible pin gap to where one pin may be here, the other pin may be way down here. Understanding what you're comfortable with, and whether it's a gap and hold over, a gap and hold under, everything within compound archery, within the sight setting, is based off references that you set that you're then going to correlate and utilize to your desired sight picture. Okay, so these are things that, in my opinion, for consistency, accuracy, and everything with bow hunting and archery is all about consistency, eliminating variables. If one time you're going to gap shoot, another time you're going to hold over, another time you're going to hold under, you're probably not going to be as consistent and as effective and efficient as you would be if you picked one and you just rolled with it. Okay. Now, obviously, if you have a 31 yard shot and you have a 30 yard reference, okay, that's different. But once you get within those gaps of the pins within that, that 5 to 7 yard range that's in the middle, it's best if you identify a process and stick with it for repeatability and consistency. So video number 1, again, desired sight picture, understanding your pins as references, understanding that whether you're gap shooting, holding through the pins, or on a spot, using that gap within the 2 pins that they've created, or starting there, identifying a reference, and then holding on the reference point, okay? Those are things that, again, sometimes are overlooked. Sometimes people just assume that you should know, hey, well, that pin's a 20 yard reference as a 30. If you want to hold 27, that, you just need to do it this way. And it's not ever anything that's really talked about or identified. So gap shooting, identify a sight picture, hold over, hold under. This can also be applied to a single pin type of sight as well. I know there's some guys out there that like to shoot single pin sights, and I personally don't like that for hunting, as most of my hunting is done spot and stock or still hunting from the ground, to where everything's always moving, everything's fluid. And some people say, I'll set my pin at 30 yards or 35 yards, I'll hold under, hold over. If this is not something you practice a lot, an example, if you have, again, this scenario where let's just say your pin is set at 35 yards, okay, and this animal happens to be at 17 yards. If you don't know the distance or roughly the amount of hold under you need to have for that scenario, if your 35 yard pin is set, you may have to be holding down here in the assumption that your housing is centered here with this post, this up pin, right? Here's your level, here's your pin, here's your single pin, but your desired shot location is going to be somewhere in this area here. So that amount of hold over, hold under can be tricky. I like more references personally. If this is something you choose to do, I would almost recommend starting up close, setting your sight setting in a certain place, starting up close and walking back and shooting distance, and so you know your trajectory, and you've got a better idea as to all those locations, all those distances, hold over, hold under, because there's some people that do this very well, and even out to 40, 45 yards, they'll use one pin and be very effective. But you have to understand your process. You have to understand that in the same scenario, if you set your pin at 30, this is getting a little bit gumbled up here, but if you set your pin at 30 and you have a 45-yard shot, that amount of drop between 30 and 45 yards is going to be significant. So the time that you have to put into understanding your tools is very important, because again, it may be something that this up pin, you know, is sitting up here somewhere to be able to drop and hit in the right spot. To me, this is too much guesswork. Again, if this is what you do, I'm not judging you. This is more identifying the different methods of aiming. And again, if you're in a more controlled setting like a ground blind or a tree stand, to where you know that your shots are possibly limited to 40 yards and everything is going to be 40 yards and in, you want to set that top pin at 27 or 30, that's different. This is, again, I'm more referring to hunting from the ground as to where my opinion is developed from. So in a tree stand ground blind setting, yeah, a one pin setup can be very effective, because again, you're less moving parts, you got more of the animal in your sight picture, you got one thing to focus on, but you need to understand your style of hunting, your place for hunting. You know, I have multiple bows set up for, usually I have one set up that I'm going to be hunting out east in a tree stand when I'm doing whitetail hunting or turkey hunting, and a different bow that I'm hunting the west from an energy and efficiency standpoint, as well as multiple references for my style of hunting. So we're going to get more into effective range and how the yardage judging aspect of it falls into place on what we coach in the next video. But we're going to go ahead and wrap this one up, as it's getting a little bit long. We want to keep these a little bit shorter and kind of on topic. So again, different methods for aiming, different principles for what style of sight you choose to use, and consider where you're going to be hunting before you purchase your sight, or if you're looking to upgrade or purchase a different sight. So hope you enjoyed this first topic, this first video. We're going to continue on again as we get into yardage judging and how the speed game plays into your system. We'll see you guys soon.